more powerful theoretical criticism was encompassed in an interpretation known as functionalism. This basically dealt with the evolutionist argument by ignoring it. It is the basic structure on which many of these talks have been based. It is evident in the work of people like Haddon, Boas, Rivers, and others, and later in the work of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. These writers rejected this kind of evolutionary history, what they sometimes termed conjectural history, or the attempt to place things in stages and in an evolutionary series. They said it's conjectural, we don't know whether it's right or wrong, and therefore there's no evidence, and therefore there's no point in going on speculating. Let's instead try to see what part kinship actually plays in the society, how it functions, what it does for the society. How are things interconnected as they are now, not as they were in the past? For example, what does bride wealth do for a society? What is its purpose in a society? How are joking relationships with in-laws to be seen in terms of a contradiction in roles, for example? What do they do? Why do people joke? Not answering why do they joke by saying, well, they've joked for many centuries in the past, or they got the idea of joking from the Middle East, but because there is tension between in-laws and you resolve this by joking. The two most important theoreticians from this school of functionalism were probably Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. Malinowski's main contribution was not really to the theoretical side of kinship studies so much as in providing or in helping to reinforce the method by which very good and high-class data on kinship and marriage systems was gathered, the famous method of participant observation, that is actually going to society, participating and also observing what goes on. He was a superb ethnographer who wrote very detailed accounts of Trobriand Island life. His main theoretical contributions were more disputed. One of them was his emphasis on the family as a universal human grouping and the basis from which all of kinship springs. As he put it, I should say that the family is always the domestic institution par excellence. It dominates the early life of the individual. It controls domestic cooperation. It is the stage of earliest parental care and education. And kinship for him was an extension out of that small nuclear family. There have been all sorts of attacks on this extensionist view, as it's called. For example, as we've seen in these talks, the family is not a universal human grouping in that sense. And there are many features of kinship, for example, the kinship terminology, the wider incest taboos, which are not explained by an extension of sentiments from the nuclear family. On the other hand, he did do a great deal of valuable service, for example, in debunking Freud's theories of the Oedipus complex by distinguishing between the social and genetic fatherhood in the Trobriand Islands, and in stressing the importance of the principle of legitimacy, of legitimate heirs, that, namely, in all human societies, a father is regarded by law, custom, and morals as an indispensable element of the procreative group. More important, though, in the contribution to theory about kinship and marriage was Radcliffe Brown. He was a student of W.H. Rivers, who helped develop the conception of the kinship system as composed of both terminology and patterns of social behavior. And he was able to see how kinship acts as an integral part of a wider social structure. He looked at the family in terms of formal rights, duties and obligations, rather than as Malinowski had done in terms of sentiment and feeling. His basic unit was not the nuclear family, but dyadic sets of relationships in which mother and child, father and child were linked. Among his major contributions and stresses were to show how kinship functions, and this is why it's known as functionalism. As he put it, the general theory that the raison d'etre of an institution or custom is to be found in its social function. The theory is therefore that the rules or customs relating to prohibited or preferred marriages have for their social function to preserve, maintain, or continue an existing kinship system as a system of institutionalized relations. Of course, it has a degree of circularity. It functions because it functions. On the other hand, it did provide a legitimate excuse for actually looking at kinship and marriage and not theorizing too much about how it had got there. Also, he showed how marriage was a rearrangement of social structure and not just a private relationship between individuals as it was in the West. He was the one who largely developed the contrast between cognatic and agnatic systems, between lineal and non-unilineal systems, which we now take for granted. He classified father-right, patrilineal systems, and mother-right, cognatic systems, and other more exotic systems such as double unilineal and other systems. He showed the way in which alternate generations, that is, for example, grandparents and grandchildren, merged and became close together, whereas there was an opposition between parents and children. And he showed the importance of the sibling group, that siblings were very closely united, the unity of the sibling group. A great deal, indeed, of what we learn now is based on his work and the work of his students, because many of the people about whom I've talked and who can be seen on the kinship diagram of kinship theorists like Edmund Leach, Meyer Fortes, and others were influenced by Radcliffe Brown and also by Malinowski. Finally, the last interpretation I'll mention is that of structuralism, and this is associated with the name of Claude Lévi-Strauss, particularly in his great work, The Elementary Structures of Kinship. Here, some of the major findings were, as we've seen, the distinction between complex and elementary systems of kinship, the stress on marriage and marriage alliances as being alliances between groups rather than a stress on descent and descent groups, which had been inherited from Radcliffe Brown. Behind all his work, though, there lay a completely different idea of what the purpose of anthropology was and a different idea of structure. And this is why it's known as structuralism. It's, in fact, derived from linguistics. And whereas the British regarded social structure as a mechanism of which kinship was a part, rather like a wheel is a part of a car, and in order to understand the wheel, you have to understand how it functions in relation to the other parts of the structure. For the French structuralists like Lévi-Strauss, thinking in linguistic terms, structure lies in the opposition, in the relation of relations, in the opposition between A and B, in the opposition between groups. And the meaning also lies in exchange, how societies exchange, women exchange ideas, and how they circulate these things. So there was a good deal of misunderstanding at first between the two notions of social structure. Edmund Leach, Rodney Needham, and others of their pupils, or at least been influenced very strongly by this French form of structuralism. Perhaps I can end this lecture by reminding you that even if it's been difficult to absorb some of these theoretical ideas, you're not in bad company. The best field worker of them all, as we saw, Malinowski wrote, "I may say that whenever I meet Mrs. Seligman or Dr. Lowy, or discuss matters with Radcliffe Brown or Kroeber, names which are now beginning to be familiar, I become at once aware that my partner does not understand anything in the matter, and I end usually with the feeling that this also applies to myself." And although I hope you won't feel that for too long, it is a difficult subject, and there are many technical terms which one has to master.